put that down right now! Since when do we let a black cleaning lady handle a platinum patient's medical chart?
Doctor Prescott Vance sneered, snatching the clipboard right out of her hands and letting it drop onto the counter with a flat, mocking clack. The 6 residents behind him burst into a cruel, arrogant laugh. Vance smirked, forcing a dirty yellow mop handle into her palm.
This is a serious patient chart for real Ivy League medical experts. This trash belongs to you. People like you use the service elevator, stay in the back hallway where you belong, and leave the real medicine to the men on the magazine covers. Try not to get lost wiping our floors!
The woman in the Navy uniform didn't scream or argue. She stood perfectly still, absorbing the public humiliation in absolute silence. Vance had absolutely no idea that this invisible woman had opened more human hearts and saved more lives than every doctor on that elite floor combined. He just saw a nobody. But in 90 hours, this celebrity surgeon was going to perform a catastrophic, fatal operation on a dying 7-year-old girl. And the only person alive who knew the hidden truth, the only one who could save that child's life, was the very woman he just ordered to clean the toilets. Welcome back to Black Stories. Today, we bring you an incredible, gripping account of hidden mastery, institutionnelle arrogance, and ultimate justice. If you believe true genius can never be wiped away by a uniform, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. Let's dive into how a system that tried to silence an invisible woman ended up begging on its knees for her hands. There is a particular kind of invisibility that money buys. The Lattimore Heart Institute had bought it in marble. 3 stories of white stone and blue glass on the north edge of Atlanta. A fountain in the circular drive. Valets in maroon vests. A lobby so quiet and so cold that the air itself felt expensive. On the far wall, 2 stories tall, ran the donor board. Brass letters on black granite, listing the families who had paid to put their names where everyone could see them. Platinum Circle, Diamond Benefactors, the Lattimore family, in letters a foot high. Because the old man's fortune had built the place, Adaeze Okonkwo cleaned the floor beneath that wall every night at 2 in the morning. And the brass letters reflected her in their polish. Small and bent and pushing a cart. The richest names in Georgia, and underneath them, a woman they would never learn to see. She had a system. The night shift always did. Start on 3. Work down to the lobby. They hit the cardiac wings between the rounds when the hallways went empty, and the only sound was the machines breathing for people who could not breathe for themselves. She knew those machines the way other people know the voices of their own children. The steady electronic chirp of a normal heart rhythm, the faster, anxious beep of a monitor that has noticed something the nurse hasn't yet. The long, flat scream that meant a family was about to receive the worst phone call of their lives. She had learned, over 2 years of mopping, to tell the difference between an alarm that meant check the lead and an alarm that meant run. Sometimes she would pause her cart in a doorway, listen for 1 extra second, and move on. And a few times, more than a few, a code had been called minutes later in exactly the room she had paused outside. Nobody noticed that. Either. Her supervisor, a tired man named Roland, who was kinder than most, had told her once, "Ada, you don't talk much, Do you? It wasn't a question. She had only smiled and said, I listen, Roland. And that was the truth. The whole truth. And nothing but. Though he had no idea how deep it ran, because before she was the woman with the mop, Adaeze Okonkwo had been Professor Okonkwo, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at one of the largest teaching hospitals in Lagos. She had trained at the University of Ibadan and done a fellowship at a great London hospital whose name still opened doors on 3 continents. Just not. It turned out, in the state of Georgia, she had spent 26 years inside the human chest. She had held hearts the size of her fist in her 2 palms and felt them remember how to beat. She had written papers that surgeons in this very building had read in their training, had cited, had built careers on without ever once imagining that the author might one day be emptying their trash. She had come to America 8 years ago because her husband, Chuka, a professor of engineering, had been offered a position at Georgia Tech, and they had told each other it would be an adventure for their last decades. 3 years in, a stroke took him in his sleep, quietly, the way the cruelest things often come, and Ada, 53, and suddenly alone, in a country that did not recognize a single day of her life's work, discovered the machinery that grinds people like her into dust. Her medical license meant nothing here. To practice, she would need to repeat years of residency. Residencies that quietly did not select 55-year-old foreign women, no matter how many lives they had saved. She had applied for clinical roles below her training. Far below. Nurse aide, surgical tech, even a blood draw position that a teenager could have filled. She had sat across desks from people half her age, who glanced at her record, at the foreign school names, at her face, and slid it back across the table with the same soft, rehearsed regret. We're looking for candidates with U.S. experience. The fit isn't quite right. We'll keep you on file. She had bills. She had a sister back home. She sent money to Blank and Wong. She had a granddaughter, Zara, 9 years old, whose mother, Ada's daughter, worked 2 jobs in Houston and could not do it alone. So, when the Lattimore Heart Institute posted an opening in environmental services, night shift, no experience required, Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo, surgeon and fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, had put on a Navy uniform and picked up a mop, and she had told no one what those letters after her name meant. Not because she was ashamed. Pride was not the problem. Survival was. She had learned, the hard way, that in America, a black woman who knows more than the men around her is not admired for it. She is resented for it. And resentment, when it comes from men with power over your paycheck and your immigration paperwork, can end you. So she made herself small. She made herself quiet. She made herself the woman with the cart who never met your eyes. And she carried 26 years of mastery, folded up inside her like a letter she was no longer allowed to send. The only thing she had not made small was the object she kept in the inner pocket of her uniform. Over her heart, every single shift. A stethoscope. Old. The tubing was original rubber, gone slightly stiff. The chest piece, solid brass, worn to a soft gold from generations of hands. the bell engraved in a fine script, too faded to read unless you knew it was there. Dr. C. Okonkwo. Her father? The first physician their village had ever produced. A man who had walked 4 miles each way to a colonial clinic to beg for training, who had come home and set bones and pulled fevers and delivered babies by lamplight for 40 years, who had pressed that brass bell to 10,000 chests and taught his daughter to do the same when she was small enough to sit on his knee. Adaeze, he used to say, the bell warm from his hands as he placed it in hers. The machines they will give you one day. The screens? The numbers. They are good servants and terrible masters. But the body, my daughter, the body never lies. It is always telling you the truth. The only question, and here he would tap her chest, right over her own small heart, is whether you are humble enough and human enough to listen. She had listened her whole life. She listened now. In a marble building full of men who had stopped, there was one other person on that night floor who saw her, really saw her. His name was Marcus Bell, 23, broad-shouldered, born and raised 3 exits down Interstate 20, working as a patient care tech while he saved for nursing school and studied flashcards in the break room at 4 in the morning with the exhausted devotion of a man who knew exactly how narrow his door was. Marcus had noticed, weeks in, that the cleaning lady would sometimes glance at a monitor and go still, and that the things she noticed had a way of coming true. He had started, shyly, to ask her questions. What does it mean when this number does that? Why do they give that medication and not the other one? And Ada, who could not be a doctor here, found that she could not stop herself from being a teacher. She kept it small. A sentence here, a word there. Always in the language of someone who had picked things up over the years. But Marcus was not a fool. One night, he watched her explain, in 30 quiet seconds, why a patient's swelling and the particular rattle in his breathing pointed to a failing right heart, and not the lungs the chart blamed. And he looked at her the way you look, at a stranger who has just spoken your secret name, Miss Ada. He said carefully, "Where'd you learn all that?" She wiped the counter. She did not look up. "A long way from here," she said. And a long time ago, he let it go. But after that, Marcus brought her his hardest questions and saved her the good coffee from the doctor's lounge and called her Miss Ada with a respect the men in white coats had never once shown her. It was the only classroom she had left. She did not know yet how much it would come to matter. She did not know yet about the girl in room 9. Imani Carter loved to run. That was the cruelest part. Her mother would say later, of all the children in the world, the body that had betrayed her belonged to a little girl who lived to run, who ran to the bus, ran the bases, ran circles around her cousins, in the cul-de-sac, shrieking with joy. A 7-year-old engine of pure motion with 2 missing front teeth and a gap-toothed grin she gave away for free. And then, 11 months before any of this, she had run across her own backyard, laughing, and dropped like someone had cut a string, just for a moment. 5 seconds, maybe 10. Her lips went the gray-blue of a winter sky. And then color came back, and she sat up and cried more from confusion than from pain. And her mother, Yvonne, told herself It was the heat. Children faint. It happens. But it happened again at school 3 weeks later, during a relay race, and again at her cousin's birthday party, chasing the dog, and a pattern emerged so clear that even terror could not blink it away. Imani Carter collapsed when she ran, when she pushed her body, when her small heart was asked to do the most. At rest, on the couch, in the doctor's quiet office. She was a perfectly healthy little girl. Askia to run, and something inside her chest reached its limit and shut the lights off. Yvonne Carter was a nurse. That mattered. And it meant she knew enough to be properly afraid, to know that a child who faints with exertion is not a child being dramatic, and it meant, over the next 11 months, that she got to watch from the inside, as the system she worked in dismissed her daughter with a politeness so smooth it could have been mistaken for care. The first pediatrician ran a heart tracing, at rest, of course, and pronounced it normal. Kids, her age, sometimes learn that fainting gets a reaction, he said gently. And Yvonne wanted to put her hand through the wall. The second doctor diagnosed anxiety and suggested Imani might be acting out for attention, perhaps about the divorce. Was there a divorce? There was no divorce. The third ordered a wearable heart monitor, caught nothing, because Imani had the good sense not to nearly die on a Tuesday in a clinic, and shrugged. By the fifth specialist, Yvonne had learned to recognize the look, the slight, weary tightening around the eyes that said, "Here is another anxious black mother." Certain her healthy child is special. She had learned that her nursing badge bought her 10% more patience and 0% more belief. She had learned that the words fainting with exertion in a young child, which should have set off sirens, somehow softened to growing pains and sensitive temperament the moment they were applied to her brown-skinned little girl. You have to understand how it works, Yvonne would say later, to a reporter, her voice flat with old fury. If Imani had been a little white girl from Buckhead, they'd have had her in a heart lab in a week, because she was mine. They had her in therapy and told me to relax. The fortune went first, the savings, then the second mortgage, then the church fundraiser passed, hand to hand on a Sunday, then the credit cards. By the time a cardiologist friend pulled a string and got Imani a charity slot at the Lattimore Heart Institute, the best in the South, the place with the marble and the brass, the Carter family was $140,000 in debt for the privilege of being told, over and over, that nothing was wrong with a child who turned blue when she played. And at the Lattimore, they met Dr. Prescott Vance. You have to understand who Vance was, because the building understood it perfectly. He was the chief of cardiac surgery. Yes. But more than that, he was the face of the place. Silver hair, square jaw, a voice built for the morning shows he appeared on. America's heart surgeon, according to a magazine cover that hung, framed, outside his office. He gave keynote speeches about excellence. He had a foundation, a mémoire, a waiting list of grateful donors. He had reached the summit of American medicine and acquired, somewhere along the way, the single most dangerous belief a doctor can hold, the certainty that he could no longer be wrong. He met the Carters for 11 minutes. He glanced at 11 months of records, the way a man glances at a menu he's already decided against. And then he did the thing that would, in 90 hours, nearly kill Imani Carter. He found an answer that made him the hero. There's a thickening here, in the muscle of the left side of the heart, he announced, tapping a printed image with a gold pen, addressing the residents more than the mother. Classic obstructive cardiomyopathy, the outflows being choked during exertion. That's your fainting. Textbook. He smiled, pleased with the diagnosis, the way some men are pleased with a good golf swing. We'll do a surgical myectomy. Shave the muscle. Open the channel. I've done hundreds. She'll be running by spring. Even. Nurse that she was, asked the question that saved her daughter's life. Though she didn't know it yet, the other doctors didn't see that thickening. Are you sure that's what's making her faint? Because she's totally fine until she runs. And then, Vance's smile cooled by precisely 2 degrees. Mrs. Carter, I have been operating on hearts since before you finished high school. I appreciate that you've done a great deal of reading. A pause. Waited. Surgical. Sometimes, a mother needs there to be one big villain. The body is rarely so dramatic. Trust the man you came here to see. He was already standing. We'll schedule for Thursday morning. First case. It was Monday. The operation was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically. Fatally wrong. There was no obstructive cardiomyopathy. The thickening Vance had seen was a normal variant misread by a man who had stopped looking carefully years ago. The real reason Imani Carter fell when she ran was something else entirely, something she had been born with. Something hiding in a place. His scans had crossed over a dozen times without anyone's eyes stopping. And the operation he had scheduled for Thursday. Opening her chest, putting her tiny body on a heart-lung machine, cutting healthy muscle to fix a problem she did not have, would have stressed the very thing that was actually killing her. At the very moment she was most fragile, and she would have died on his table, under the bright lights with her mother, in the waiting room, and his confident hands inside her chest. He would have called it a tragedy, a surgical risk, one of those rare outcomes, and no one would ever have known the truth. No one. That is, except the woman who emptied the trash in room 9 at 2 a.m, because on Monday night, Adaeze Okonkwo pushed her cart through the door of the pediatric cardiac wing and saw a 7-year-old girl awake in the blue dark, too scared to sleep, and a mother folded into a chair beside her, holding the small hand like a rope over a cliff, and Ada, who had spent 26 years reading the bodies of frightened children, paused, her cart in the doorway, the way she always did, and she began, without meaning to listen. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself that every night, for 3 nights, on the first night, Ada only watched. She mopped the corner of room 9 slowly, the way a person moves carefully around a sleeping animal, and she listened to the child's chart the way her father had taught her. Not the paper, the body. She saw the oxygen number sitting in the high 90s. Perfectly fine. The kind of number that lets a careless doctor close the folder. She saw the resting heart tracing taped to the bedrail, clean as a bell. She saw, in short, exactly what every expert before her had seen. A healthy little girl. And then Imani, restless, frightened of Thursday, climbed out of bed against the rules to reach a drawing she'd dropped, and crossed the room in 6 quick steps. And Ada, watching, saw it, effluda, a flicker behind the child's eyes, the briefest gray pass across her lips, gone in a heartbeat, so fast that a monitor would round it off as nothing, so subtle that the night nurse charting at the desk 3 feet away noticed only that the girl had gotten out of bed. 6 steps, just 6 steps of mild exertion. And for half a second, the lights inside Imani Carter had dimmed. Ada's mop stopped moving. She knew that flicker. She had seen it before. Decades before. An ocean away. A boy in Lagos, 9 years old, who fainted at football and was fine on the ward, whose resting tests sang of perfect health, whose own family had been told for 2 years that he was lazy or dramatic or weak. She had been the one who finally asked the right question, not what is wrong when he rests, but what changes when he runs? And the answer had been a thing she would never forget. His left coronary artery, the one feeding the largest muscle of his heart, did not come off the aorta where God intended. It came off at a wrong angle, ran a wrong path, threaded between the 2 great vessels of the chest. And when the boy ran, when his heart swelled and those great vessels filled and pressed together, they pinched that misplaced artery shut like a foot on a garden hose. The muscle starved. The lights went out, and then he would stop, and the pressure would ease, and the blood would flow, and he would sit up confused and cry, fine at rest, dying with every sprint. A defect he was born with, one that resting scans skate over and that kills very often. The first time anyone lets the child push hard enough on a soccer field, in a gym class, at a relay race, with no warning at all except the small, ignored faintings that come before. She had fixed that boy, opened his chest, freed the strangled artery, reattached it where it belonged, and watched him grow up and play and live. She had written about cases like his. She had taught them to students who were now department chairs. And here, in a marble building in Atlanta, a 7-year-old girl was scheduled in 3 days for an operation on a problem she did not have, while the thing that was actually killing her sat hidden in plain sight on scans. A celebrity had glanced at and crossed over. Ada knew. She knew the way you know your own name. And she said nothing, because she was the woman with the mop. On the second night, she could not stay away. She came back to room 9 and found the mother, Ivan, awake and red-eyed in the chair. And Ada did a small, forbidden thing. She spoke to her, not as a doctor, as a cleaning woman who'd had children. She is a fighter. Your girl, Ada said softly, emptying the bin. I see her medicine. They are going to operate. And Yvonne, starved, for anyone who would simply talk to her, poured it out. The 11 months, the fortune, the men who said she was anxious. And now this Thursday surgery, she could not shake a bad feeling about. He says it's the muscle being too thick, Yvonne whispered. But miss, she's only ever bad when she runs. When she's still, she's my normal baby. Does that sound like a thick muscle to you? It was the exact question. The mother had reached it by love and fear, alone. The same question Ada had asked in Lagos 30 years before. And the question Prescott Vance had been too important to ask. What changes when she runs? Ada's whole body wanted to answer. She felt the words climb her throat. Your daughter's heart is starving when she runs, because an artery is being pinched shut, and the operation he has scheduled will not fix it. And it may stop her heart on the table. Make them look again. Make them image the arteries that feed the muscle. Under stress. Make them, and she heard. Over that. The other voice. The survival voice she had built over 8 years. You are a cleaning woman. You have no license here. You have no standing. If you say one word of medicine to this family, and it reaches Vance, you will be fired before sunrise. And your immigration paperwork sits in a drawer that men like him can reach. And your granddaughter in Houston eats because of the checks you send. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. This is not your country and not your fight. And these people did not ask you. She closed the bin. She did not answer the question. Pray for her. She said instead. And her own cowardice tasted like ash. And ask them many questions before Thursday. You are her mother. That is a kind of doctor they cannot take from you. She pushed her card out and stood in the empty hallway with her hand pressed over the brass stethoscope in her pocket, over her own loud heart. And she thought about Neka, her little sister, the laughing one, 4 years younger, who at 11 had started to tire on the walk to school and to gasp climbing the smallest hill. There had been no Lattimore Institute in their village. There had been her father with his brass bell and his lamp, and a heart problem he could hear but could not fix, and a city hospital 2 days' journey away that the family could not afford in time. Ada had been 15. She had held her sister's hand in the back of a borrowed truck on a red dirt road and watched the lights go out of a face she loved more than her own. Slowly, over a long, terrible day. Because the world had decided that a poor black girl's failing heart was not worth the distance. That was why Adaeze Okonkwo had become a heart surgeon. Not for Prestige. For Neka. To be? For someone else's sister. The help that had not come for hers. And now she was standing in a marble hallway full of every resource her village had lacked, with the knowledge to save a child sleeping 40 feet away. And she was choosing to be quiet to protect a paycheck. Her father's voice came to her, then, clear as the brass in her pocket. The body never lies. The only question is whether you are humble enough and human enough to listen. And she understood, standing there, that she had been hiding behind the first half of that lesson and betraying the second. She had been listening to the girl's body for 3 nights. The humility was easy. It was the human enough she had been failing. To listen and stay silent was not humility. It was a second kind of deafness. And it would kill a child. On the 3rd night, Wednesday, the night before the operation, she stopped pretending. She found Marcus on his break and asked him, very casually, what he knew about the Carter case. And Marcus, who knew everything that moved on that floor, told her, Thursday, 7 in the morning. First case, the chief himself, a myectomy. And Ada said, carefully, testing a door, Marcus, if a person believed that diagnosis was wrong, that the real problem was an artery being compressed, something that only shows under stress, something an operation like that could make fatal. Who would that person tell? Marcus went very still, in the way he had learned to go still around her. Miss Ada, he said slowly, what are you telling me right now? I am asking a question, she said. Who would they tell? You tell the surgeon, or his chief resident. He searched her face. But Miss Ada, Vance is the chief. There's nobody over him on cardiac except the chief of medicine. And that's Dr. Pierce. And you do not just walk up to Naomi Pierce. And anyway, he stopped, hearing himself, hating it. Anyway, who's going to believe? Who's going to believe the cleaning woman? Ada finished gently. Yes, I know. She tried anyway. She owed the child the attempt, even a doomed one. Late Wednesday, she carried a fresh stack of towels into the surgical floor's workroom, where two of Vance's residents were prepping the morning's cases. And she set them down. And in the smallest, most apologetic voice she could find, she said, "Excuse me, doctors." The little girl, in 9, I have cleaned her room 3 nights. She only faints when she moves, when she runs, not at rest. My father was a kind of doctor. Back home, he always said, when the trouble comes only with exertion, you must look at the arteries that feed the muscle, the ones that wrap the heart. The taller resident, a young man named Ryan Keller, looked up with an expression of such pure, startled contempt that it answered everything. I'm sorry. Are you giving us a diagnosis? He laughed, glancing at his colleague, to make sure the absurdity was shared. Mom, I don't know what kind of doctor your dad was back home. But doctor, Vance read the films himself. You understand that I'm a surgical resident at the #1 heart center in the Southeast. And you're, he gestured, not unkindly, which was somehow worse, at the towels, the cart, the Navy uniform. We're good on the towels. Thank you, please, Ada said. Just ask him to look at the arteries under stress before he opens her. 1 scan. If I am wrong, you lose nothing. If I am right, you save. Okay. I really have to ask you to head out now. Keller's patience was gone. This is a sterile prep area. I'll let housekeeping know you wandered in. He turned his back. She stood there 1 more second, and then she picked up her cart and left. Because there was nothing else a woman with a mop could do. She had tried the proper channels. The proper channels had pointed her to the supply closet. She went home at dawn and could not sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table with her father's stethoscope in her hands and Neka's face behind her eyes. And she watched the clock crawl toward 7, toward the operating room where Prescott Vance was about to cut into a child for a disease she did not have. And Adaeze Okonkwo made the decision that would cost her everything she had spent 8 years protecting and give her back the one thing she had spent 8 years pretending she could live without. She put on her uniform. She put the stethoscope over her heart. And at 6:40 that morning, when the day shift was thin and the surgical floor was waking, Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo, who had been ordered to stay in her lane, walked back through the doors of the Lattimore Heart Institute to do her job. The real one. For the first time in 8 years, The pre-op holding bay smelled of antiseptic and money. Imani Carter lay on a gurney under a thin white blanket, a paper cap over her braids, a teddy bear, missing one eye tucked under her arm, looking so small against the machinery that Yvonne, gowned, allowed to walk beside her, this far and no farther, kept one hand flat on her daughter's chest, as if she could hold the heart in by pressing on the door. Prescott Vance stood a few feet off in a knot of residents and nurses, scrubbed to the elbows, narrating to his audience, relaxed, magnificent, a man about to perform, straightforward, myectomy. We'll go in through the aorta. I want the fellows watching the septum, he was saying. When the doors swung open and a woman in a Navy Environmental Services uniform walked into the sterile corridor and did not stop walking. For a moment, nobody reacted, because the brain refuses what the eyes report. A cleaning woman, here, now, walking toward the chief, like she had business. A nurse started forward to redirect her. Vance frowned. The great machine of his certainty, slow to register the interruption. Ada stopped at the foot of Imani's gurney. She looked at the child. Then she looked up, and her voice, when it came, was not small. It was not apologetic. It was the voice of Professor Okonkwo, addressing a room, a voice that had not been used in 8 years. And it filled the corridor. Stop. Do not take this child into that room. Silence cracked across the bay. This girl does not have obstructive cardiomyopathy, Adaeze Okonkwo said clearly, into the dead air. She has a coronary artery that runs the wrong path and is being crushed under exertion. If you put her on the heart-lung machine and shave a muscle that is not blocking anything, you will stress the one vessel that is killing her, and you will lose her on the table. You must image her coronary arteries under stress before you make a single cut. Today. Now. Before this goes one step further. For 3 full seconds. No one breathed. Then Prescott Vance began to laugh. It started as a disbelieving exhale and built into something cruel and delighted. The laughter of a man handed an unbelievable gift. Oh, he said, wiping at his eye. Oh, this is Karen. Are you getting this? The cleaning lady has a diagnosis. He turned to his residents, arms wide, performing for them. A wrong-way coronary. Listen to hair. Where did you learn the phrase, sweetheart? A daytime soap. The residents laughed because he was laughing. Ryan Keller laughed loudest, then caught the cleaning woman's eye and faltered because he recognized her. She'd tried to tell him last night, in the workroom, and he'd sent her to the supply closet, and a cold thread of something he didn't want to feel went down his spine. Get her out of my surgical corridor, Vance said, the laughter snapping off into ice. Now, and I want her badge by noon. Who hired this woman? Roland. You let your staff wander into pre-op and practice medicine on my patients. He turned his back on her. The most powerful gesture he knew. Take the girl in. We're already behind. Wait. It was Yvonne. The mother had not taken her eyes off Ada's face. A nurse moved to wheel the gurney, and Yvonne stepped into its path. One arm out. Wait. Wait. Her voice was shaking. She said the same thing. I've been asking for 11 months. That my baby's only bad when she runs. 11 months I've been asking why she's fine, sitting still, and falls down when she runs, and not one of you would answer me. She rounded on Vance, and there was nothing soft left in her. She answered me. The cleaning lady answered me. So you tell me. Doctor, you tell me right now why you're so sure. And you use small words. Because I am not putting my child in that room on your laughing, Mrs. Carter, Vance said, with the strained patience of a man whose performance has been interrupted twice. I understand this is emotional, but I cannot run a surgical program by polling the housekeeping staff. The diagnosis is mine. The responsibility is mine. The film? Then look at the film again. A new voice. Quiet. Levo. And it changed the temperature of the room because of who it belonged to. Dr. Naomi Pierce, Chief of Medicine, had come around the corner during the laughter and stood now, with her arms folded and her eyes moving. From the furious mother, to the smirking chief, to the woman in the Navy uniform who had used words like coronary artery and heart-lung machine, and through the aorta with the unmistakable, unteachable cadence of a person who had said them 10,000 times. Pierce was a black woman who had clawed her way up through 40 years of rooms exactly like this one. And she had a finely tuned instrument for one particular sound. The sound of expertise coming out of a mouth that the room had decided to ignore. Prescott, she said. 2 minutes. We pull the imaging up right here, and you walk me through why it's a myectomy and not a coronary. If you're right, you've lost 2 minutes, and I'll apologize to you personally. If there's any doubt at all, we don't take a 7-year-old onto the heart-lung machine on a maybe. She did not phrase it as a request. Vance's jaw worked. Naomi, this is absurd. You're going to delay my case because the chief of medicine asked you to. Pierce said pleasantly. Pull it up. They pulled it up. A nurse wheeled a monitor. The films loaded, and Prescott Vance, jaw tight, began to narrate his certainty. Here, the thickness, you can see the outflow narrowing under, and Ada took 2 steps forward, uninvited, and said, May I? And before anyone could stop her, she reached out one finger and touched the screen. Not where Vance was pointing, but 2 inches away, at the root of the great vessel, at a faint dark thread that crossed where no one's eye had stopped. There, she said. The left main artery does not begin where it should. It comes from the wrong place and runs between the aorta and the lung vessel, threaded through the one gap it should never enter. At rest, the vessels are slack, and it stays open. That is why every test you ran while she sat still was normal. When she runs, the great vessels swell. They squeeze it flat. The muscle starves. She faints. She traced the thread, the length of its wrong path, while the room went silent. Your thickening is a normal variant. Shave it, and you fix nothing. But put this child on the machine. Clamp her aorta. Work around that root for an hour while you chase a phantom, and you may kink or close the one artery, keeping the largest part of her heart alive. She will arrest, and you will not understand why. And you will tell this mother it was a rare surgical risk. She turned from the screen and looked at Vance directly, and her voice dropped, and somehow that made it land harder. I have seen this exact anatomy more times than you have read about it. I am telling you the truth. The body has been telling you the truth for 11 months. You were too busy being right to listen. The corridor was so quiet you could hear the monitors in the next bay. Naomi Pierce was not looking at the screen anymore. She was looking at the woman in the Navy uniform, at the brass shape of the stethoscope outlined under the cheap fabric over her heart, at the way she had named that anatomy, with the ease of long mastery, and a memory was surfacing in Pierce's mind. Slow, and then all at once, a paper she had read as a young attending, a landmark series on wrong-way coronary arteries out of a hospital in Lagos. An author's name she had cited herself. A name she had not thought of in 20 years. "What is your name?" Pierce said. It was not a hospital administrator asking a janitor for her badge. It was one surgeon asking another. The woman in the Navy uniform stood up very straight. 8 years of folding herself small, unfolded in a single breath. "My name," she said, "is Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo. I was chief of cardiothoracic surgery at the Lagos University Teaching Hospital. I trained at Ibadan and at the Royal Brompton in London. I have repaired this exact defect 41 times, and I have been emptying the trash on your 3rd floor for 2 years. Because in this country, my hands are good enough to clean your hospital, but not, apparently, good enough to save your patients." She looked at the small girl on the gurney, still clutching her one-eyed bear. Eyes huge. Listening to grown-ups, decide whether she would live. "So, you may take my badge at noon, but first, you will image this child's arteries, because I will not stand in this hallway and let you kill her to protect his pride." Naomi Pierce looked at the name she now remembered, attached at last to a face. "Dr. Okonkwo," she said quietly, and inclined her head. A small bow, the kind one professional gives another, across a great distance, suddenly closed. "I've read your work. Your series on wrong-way coronary arteries. The one from 2009. I cited it in my own, and just like that, in front of the residents, and the nurses, and the silver-haired chief, whose laughter had died in his throat. The most powerful doctor in the building bowed her head to the cleaning lady. "Get this child imaged," Pierce said, turning. Her voice, now a blade. "Stress protocol. Right now. Nobody touches a scalpel until I've seen it." She looked at Vance, and there was no warmth left anywhere in her face. "And Prescott, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about the last 11 months. Starting with why it took the woman who mops your floor to ask the one question you didn't. The scan took 40 minutes. The truth took 12 seconds. When the stress images loaded onto the big monitor in the reading room, Pierce, 2 radiologists, Vance, silent against the back wall, Ada standing where Pierce had told her to stand, at the front, like an attending. There was no longer any room for a man's pride to hide. There it was, the left main coronary artery, rising from the wrong place, taking its wrong and fatal path, threading the narrow space between the 2 great vessels of the chest. And in the stress images, when the simulated exertion swelled those vessels, the dark thread of the artery pinched, narrowed, nearly vanished. A foot on a garden hose. Exactly as the cleaning lady had said. Exactly as the mother had felt. Exactly as 11 months and 4 hospitals and $140,000 had failed to find one of the radiologists. A young woman breathed out a single word. God. She turned to Ada, not to Vance. You called this from across a holding bay. You didn't even have the stress films. I did not need the films. Ada said, I had the child. She told me everything when she crossed the room, in the silence. Everyone understood at once how close they had come. If Adaeze Okonkwo had stayed in her lane, if she had pushed her cart past room 9 and protected her paycheck and her paperwork, Imani Carter would already be on the machine. Her chest open, her healthy muscle under a knife, while the artery that was actually killing her closed shut for the last time. They would have buried a 7-year-old by Friday and called it a tragedy of an unusual disease. The mother would have been told her daughter had a bad heart. The chief would have spoken at the funeral, and no one alive, would ever have known that the answer had been standing in the room in a Navy uniform. Ordered to leave, Naomi Pierce turned from the screen. Dr. Okonkwo, this child needs that artery surgically corrected, freed and reattached where it belongs. And she needs it on the next reasonable list. Not as an emergency. We cobble together in a panic. Who in this building has done this operation before? The radiologists looked at each other. Vance said nothing. Nobody. Pierce answered her own question. Except the woman who diagnosed it. She held Ada's eyes. I cannot make you a Lattimore surgeon by lunch. This country's paperwork would not allow it if the sky were falling, but I am the chief of medicine, and I can grant emergency operating privileges under my license and my supervision to a physician whose credentials I can verify when no qualified alternative exists and a child's life is at stake. I have already called the Royal Brompton. They confirmed you in 90 seconds. The registrar there nearly dropped the phone when I said where you were working. A pause? Dr. Okonkwo, will you scrub in and fix this child's heart? I will stand at your shoulder. Dr. Vance will not be in my operating room. For a moment, Adaeze Okonkwo could not speak. 8 years. 8 years of folding herself small, of carrying her hands like a confession, of being the woman. They moved out of the way, and now a child needed exactly the thing those hands had been made for. And someone was finally asking, yes, she said. Just that. But her voice broke on the single word, and she pressed her palm to the brass shape over her heart. And somewhere behind her eyes, a 15-year-old girl in the back of a borrowed truck on a red dirt road set down a burden she had carried for 40 years. They let Yvonne see her first. Ada knelt beside the gurney, so her eyes were level with the mother's, and she took both of Yvonne's hands. The way you take hands, you mean to keep. And she said, I am Dr. Okonkwo. I have fixed exactly this. In children exactly this size. 41 times. Every one of them ran again. I am going to bring her back to you. And the first thing she is going to want to do is run. And you are going to let her. Yvonne made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, and pressed her forehead to the cleaning lady's hands. Why didn't they listen to you? She whispered. Why didn't they listen to either of us? And Ada said, we will talk about that for the rest of our lives. You and I, but not today. Today, I have work. Then she bent over Imani, who was watching her with enormous solemn eyes. And she did the oldest thing in medicine. She drew the brass stethoscope from over her heart, warmed the bell against her own palm, the way her father had taught her, and pressed it gently to the little girl's chest. She closed her eyes. She listened, truly listened, the way no one in 11 months had to the strong, frightened, salvageable heart of Imani Carter beating under her hand. "There you are," she murmured. "I hear you. I hear exactly what you are saying." She opened her eyes and smiled at the child. And it was the first warm smile Imani had been given in that cold marble building. "Your heart is very brave and very strong, and it has been trying to tell the grown-ups the truth for a long time. I heard it. Now, I am going to fix the one little road inside you that goes the wrong way. And then you can run as fast as you want. Forever. Do you believe me?" Imani considered this with the grave honesty of a 7-year-old. "Are you the cleaning lady?" "I am the cleaning lady." Ada agreed. "And I am a heart doctor. A person can be more than one thing. Remember that. The world will try to make you only one thing. Don't let it. What happened over the next 4 hours happened behind doors. Most people never see. I will not pretend to walk you through it as if it were simple. Because it was not. It was a child's chest open to the light. A heart the size of a small fist, stopped and held in a stranger's 2 hands. A misrouted artery, freed from its wrong and strangling path, and given back its proper road. Work at the very outer edge of what human skill can do. Performed by a surgeon who had not been allowed to perform it in 8 years, and whose hands, when she lifted them at the start, did not shake at all. Naomi Pierce stood at her shoulder the whole time, and later told people that she had watched a master at the height of a craft she'd thought she understood. And understood, watching, that she had not. The young residents who'd laughed in the corridor crowded the gallery glass in silence. Ryan Keller did not look away once, and at 11:52 that morning, Adaeze Okonkwo asked the team to let the heart fill and warm and try. And Imani Carter's repaired heart, given back the road it had been denied since before she was born, gathered itself and began to beat strong. Avon, the monitor, sang a clean, ordinary, miraculous rhythm into the room. Somewhere, a resident exhaled a curse that was really a prayer. And Dr. Okonkwo stepped back from the table, looked at the small chest, rising and falling on its own, and said the only thing her father ever said at such moments. The thing he'd said over 10,000 chests by lamplight. The thing she had not been permitted to say in 8 years. "Thank you, God, for letting me listen." Yvonne Carter was in the waiting room when Naomi Pierce came out still in her cap. And Pierce did not make her wait 1 extra second. "She's perfect," Pierce said. "The repair was perfect. Your daughter is going to run." And Yvonne Carter slid out of the plastic chair and onto the floor of that marble building and wept. And the woman who had clawed her way up through 40 years of cold rooms got down on the floor beside her and held her. Because some news is too large to receive standing up. Then Yvonne lifted her head. "The cleaning lady," she said. "Where's the cleaning lady? I have to." "She's closing," Pierce said. "She'll be out soon." "And Mrs. Carter." The chief of medicine's voice changed. "She's not the cleaning lady. She never was. And what happened to her in this building over the last 2 years is something I am going to spend the rest of my career making right, starting today. Have you ever watched the world finally see what was in front of it the whole time? Have you ever wanted to grab the people who looked right through someone and shake them and shout? She was here. She was always here. You just decided she was furniture. Hold on to that feeling. Because the building was about to find out exactly how much it had thrown away. It did not stay a secret for one day. You cannot save a dying child in front of 40 witnesses and put the genie back. By that afternoon, the whole institute knew that the woman from Environmental Services had diagnosed what the chief had missed, and then operated on the child herself, with the chief of medicine assisting. By the next morning, it was on a local news site. By the day after, it was national. Janitor at Elite Heart Hospital turns out to be world-class surgeon. Saves girl. Chief misdiagnosed. The headline wrote itself, and it carried, underneath the feel-good shimmer, a much darker question that good reporters refuse to let go. How does a surgeon of that caliber end up cleaning the floors who decided she should? And how many others are out there? Naomi Pierce did not wait for the press to ask it. She asked it herself. Formally, from inside. With the cold thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting years for a reason the board could not ignore. She opened 2 investigations the same week. The first was into Prescott Vance. Not just the Carter case. Though the Carter case alone, a fatal operation scheduled on a misread film, was enough to convene a review. Pierce ordered an audit of his outcomes, going back 10 years. And a pattern came up out of the data, like a body out of a river. Vance, it turned out, had built his glittering reputation the way certain men do. On the easy cases he kept, the credit he took for work his fellows did, and a long, quiet trail of harder cases he had misjudged and then buried under the language of surgical risk and advanced disease. And the audit found something else. Something that turned the stomach of every honest person who read it. His missed and dismissed diagnoses were not random. They clustered. They clustered on the poor. They clustered hard on black patients. Black patients in his records were documented as anxious, non-compliant, exaggerating, and drug-seeking at rates that no biology could explain. Their pain was undertreated. Their complaints were under-investigated. Yvonne Carter had been right in the most devastating way. If her daughter had been a little white girl from Buckhead, she'd have been in a heart lab in a week. The data said so in black and white. Imani Carter was not an unlucky exception. She was the rule. And she had survived the rule only because a woman the same system had thrown away happened to be holding the mop. The second investigation was into how Adaeze Okonkwo had come to be holding that mop at all. And it reached straight into the machinery of the institute itself. Because Vance, it emerged, had not only been the celebrity face of the place. For 9 years, he had chaired its physician credentialing committee. He decided who got clinical privileges and who didn't. And when Pierce subpoenaed the committee's records, there sat the rest of the truth. Adaeze Okonkwo had applied to the Lattimore Heart Institute, not for janitorial work, but as a physician. Within months of arriving in Georgia, so had dozens of other foreign-trained doctors, many of them black, many of them African and Caribbean and South Asian, carrying between them centuries of training and tens of thousands of saved lives. The committee minutes, in Vance's own hand and his appointees, told the story in the bloodless vocabulary of bureaucracy, credentials not equivalent, training pathway, non-standard, cultural fit concerns, communication, Exon. Tabled. 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 A surgeon who had run a cardiac unit for a decade had been filed under communication, Exon, by a man who would later misdiagnose a child to her face. The system had not failed to recognize Adaeze Okonkwo's brilliance. It had recognized it and filed it in a drawer and handed her a uniform, because brilliance in a black immigrant woman was not an asset to that committee. It was a problem to be managed. She was not the only one. That was the part that broke the story wide open. There was a former chief of pediatric surgery from Ghana driving for a rideshare app 40 minutes away. There was a cardiologist from Port-au-Prince working the overnight desk at a gas station. There was a woman who had run a maternal health program for 500,000 people in Lagos, who could have moved the needle on Atlanta's own brutal black maternal death numbers. Stocking shelves at a pharmacy, whose corporate parent had once rejected her for a pharmacy tech role. An entire shadow hospital's worth of expertise. Black and brown and brilliant. Locked out and made invisible. While the visible system told itself, it simply could not find qualified, diverse candidates. The candidates had been there the whole time. They had been told to use the service elevator, and then there was Curtis. Curtis Mayhew had worked security at the Lattimore Heart Institute for 11 years. A big, quiet man who saw everything from behind the lobby desk and was, like Ada, treated as a fixture. Curtis had watched, for 11 years, how the building treated the people who looked like him. Which doctors got called doctor, and which got called by their first names. Which job applicants got walked back to a warm office, and which got pointed at a clipboard. The way the night cleaning lady carried herself like someone who'd once been somebody, and Curtis, it turned out, had been keeping his own quiet records. Not officially, just a Abbott. Names. Dates. The things he'd overheard the credentialing committee say in the elevator when they thought the only person listening was the help. The morning the story broke, Curtis Mayhew walked into Naomi Pierce's office. Sat at one folder on her desk and said, "I've been waiting a long time for somebody who'd actually read this." She read it. It corroborated everything. And it named names. And it became, in the hands of the state medical board and a federal civil rights complaint, the thing that turned a scandal into a reckoning. The story refused to stay inside one building. Once the national press had the credentialing minutes, the question stopped being, how did this happen at the Lattimore, and became, how many times is this happening everywhere? Hospitals in other cities. Nervous, began quietly auditing their own committees and found their own drawers full of cultural fit concerns and their own shadow rosters of brilliant people locked out by accent and origin and skin. Physician groups that had spent years insisting there simply weren't enough. Qualified, diverse candidates were forced to look at a woman who had run a cardiac unit for a decade and been filed under communication, and to sit on camera with the lie of it, and through all of it. The thing that struck people hardest was not the scandal, but the arithmetic of waste. That a country desperate for doctors, with patients dying, for lack of them, had taken a master surgeon and paid her to mop, and would have gone on doing it forever if a child had not nearly died in front of her. Reporters wanted Ada to be a feel-good story. The heartwarming janitor turned hero, and she refused the frame to their faces. "Do not make me a miracle," she told one of them. Evenly. "A miracle lets you off the hook. I am not a miracle. I am a policy. I am what your policies did. And what they could undo tomorrow, if they chose. There are hundreds of me. Stop applauding the one you happen to find, and go look in your own building. The fall came fast. The way it does when a man has been held up by reputation rather than substance. Prescott Vance was removed as chief of cardiac surgery. Within the week, his operating privileges were suspended, pending the outcome data review. The state medical board opened a formal investigation into the Carter misdiagnosis and the pattern behind it. The Federal Civil Rights Office opened another into the discrimination the credentialing records laid bare. The magazine cover came down off the wall outside his office. The morning shows that had loved America's heart surgeon stopped returning his calls and started running segments about him with a different tone. The foundation that bore his name found, quietly, that its donors had other commitments. His memoir was pulled from a second printing, and the thing that had made him, the certainty that he could no longer be wrong, turned out to be the thing that unmade him, because a man who has never learned to say, "Let me look again," has no defense at all when the looking finally happens without him. Within a month he resigned to pursue other interests, which is the phrase such men always use. And there was no farewell, and no plaque. And his name came off the donor wall, not with ceremony, but with a maintenance worker and a putty knife on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Adaeze Okonkwo happened to be walking through the lobby when they did it, no longer in Navy. And she stopped and watched the brass letters of his name come down from the black granite, and she did not smile, because she was not a woman who smiled at funerals. But she stood there until it was done. Not everyone who had laughed in that corridor chose the same road. Though, 3 days after the surgery, Ryan Keller, the resident who had sent her to the supply closet, who had laughed loudest in the holding bay, knocked on the door of the small office Pierce had given Ada, and stood in the doorway, looking like a man who had not slept. "I sent you away," he said. There was no excuse attached to it, which was the first decent thing he'd done. "You came to me the night before with the right answer, in your own words, and I told you to take the towels and go. If you'd listened to me, that little girl would be dead. I've been a doctor for 4 years, and I just figured out I never learned the only thing that matters." His voice cracked. "You said her body had been telling the truth for 11 months, and we were too busy being right to listen. I can't stop hearing it. I don't deserve anything from you, but I'm asking, would you teach me how to listen like you do?" Ada looked at him for a long moment. He had mocked her. He had dismissed her. He had been in that corridor. Everything the system had made him. But her father had taught her something underneath all the medicine, the thing that had let her kneel beside Yvonne and hold the hands of a woman whose system had nearly killed her child. That the point of justice is not the pleasure of watching the proud fall. The point is, the next child and the next child needs doctors who have learned to hear 6 in the morning, she said finally. On rounds, you will carry the charts, and you will say nothing. And you will watch me listen. And when you think you understand, you will be wrong. And we will begin again. The ghost of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. And you will bring coffee. Doctor. Pierce takes hers very strong. Here is where most of these stories end. The villain falls. The hero is vindicated. The crowd cheers. Roll credits. But a man losing his job does not unbreak a system, and a single saved child does not unbury the shadow hospital of brilliant people still out there, driving ride shares and stocking shelves. Punishing one Prescott Vance feels like justice. It isn't. It's the beginning of justice. And only if someone does the harder thing next. Naomi Pierce did the harder thing. She went to Cornelius Lattimore himself, the silver-haired old billionaire, whose family fortune had built the marble and the fountain and the donor wall. And she did not soften it. She put the audit on his desk. She put Curtis Mayhew's folder on his desk. She put the credentialing minutes on his desk. Cultural fit concerns. Communication. Accent. Tabled and tabled and tabled. And she let the old man read in his own institution's hand how a surgeon who would later be celebrated on magazine covers had filed away an entire generation of black and immigrant physicians like junk mail. And then she said, "Your name is on the wall. Cornelius. Right now, it's on the wall of the place that nearly killed Imani Carter and made Dr. Okonkwo clean its toilets for 2 years. You get to decide what else it's on the wall of." Cornelius Lattimore was many things, but he was not a stupid man. And he was 81 years old, and thinking about what his name would mean after he was gone. He funded all of it. They built 2 things, and they named them carefully, because names are how a system remembers what it would rather forget. The first was the Okonkwo pathway, a formal program, the first of its scale in the region, to identify, fairly assess, and fast-track the credentialing of internationally trained physicians whose skills the old machinery had been built to waste. Real evaluation of real competence, run by clinicians instead of by a committee chair, with a grudge and a checklist of euphemisms. Within its first year, the pathway brought the chief of pediatric surgery from Ghana out of his rideshare and into an operating room, returned the cardiologist from Port-au-Prince to a clinic, and put the maternal health specialist from Lagos to work on the very numbers Atlanta should have been ashamed of. A shadow hospital's worth of saved lives. Walked in, out of the dark. Given back their hands. Adaeze Okonkwo was named its director. She was also, by then, the Royal Brompton's records and an expedited pathway her own program helped design, having finally moved the immovable paperwork. Dr. Okonkwo, attending cardiothoracic surgeon, Lattimore Heart Institute. Her name went up on the wall, near the operating rooms. The working wall. The one that names the people who actually open chests. She did not care about the donor wall. She cared about that one. The second thing they built, they named for the girl Imani's Rule, a patient advocacy and diagnostic safety protocol born directly out of those 11 months. Yvonne Carter spent being told her dying daughter was anxious. Under Imani's Rule, when a patient or a family insists that something is wrong after being reassured that nothing is, when the lived knowledge of the person in the bed collides with the confidence of the person in the coat, it triggers a mandatory second look by an independent clinician, with explicit attention to the bias data that the Vance audit had dragged into the light. It was built on a single radical premise. The premise that should not have been radical at all. That a black mother who says, "My child only faints when she runs," does that sound like nothing to you? Is not being difficult. She is reporting data, and the job of medicine is to listen. Yvonne Carter, who had been dismissed by that building more times than she could count, was hired to help run it, because the Institute finally understood that the person who had been ignored is the world's foremost expert on how not to ignore people. And what of the man who almost became the woman who almost cleaned floors? What of Marcus Bell, who had saved her the good coffee and called her Miss Ada when the white coats called her nothing? Ada did not forget him. She never would have. When the pathway launched, she made it her business. And the Institute funded a scholarship in her father's name, the Dr. C. Okonkwo Scholarship. And Marcus Bell started medical school the following fall with that brass bell legacy behind him and a mentor at his shoulder who had once explained the failing right heart to him over a mop bucket at 4 a.m. You were the only one in this building who saw me when I was nobody. She told him, I have spent my whole life learning that the people who are kind to the invisible are the only people worth trusting. Now, go and be the doctor who is kind to them. 1 year later, there is a sign now, near the operating suites of the Lattimore Heart Institute, that did not used to be there, beneath the name of the surgical wing. In clean letters, runs a single line. It is not a hospital slogan. It is older than that. Carried 4,000 miles and across 2 generations. From a village clinic lit by a lamp to a tower of blue glass and white stone, the body never lies. The only question is whether you are humble enough and human enough to listen. Beneath those words hangs a framed photograph, not of a surgeon in a gown, a photograph of a little girl, mid-stride, both feet off the ground, braids flying, 2 front teeth grown back in, caught in the middle of a dead sprint across a green field with her whole face open in a scream of pure joy. On the back, in a mother's handwriting, 4 words. She runs again. Thank you. Imani Carter is 8 now, and she runs everywhere, the way she was always meant to, the way her brave and stubborn heart had been begging the grown-ups to let her. Sometimes, on a Saturday, her mother brings her to the institute, and she runs, actually runs, full speed, no fear, down a hallway her family once walked through in terror, and the staff smile and let her, and she stops at a particular office and presses her face to the glass until the woman inside looks up, and Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo, attending surgeon, program director, who once emptied the trash in room 9 at 2 a.m. with 26 years of mastery folded up inside her like a letter she was no longer allowed to send. Dr. Okonkwo sets down her pen and draws an old brass stethoscope from over her heart and pretends, with enormous seriousness, to examine a perfectly healthy, gloriously fast little girl who is living proof that the answer was in the room the whole time. They just had to let her speak. So let me ask you, before you go, be honest, because the honest answer is the only one that matters. If the one person on earth who could save your child walked toward you wearing the wrong uniform, if she had the wrong accent, the wrong color, the wrong job stitched over her heart, would you let her speak? Or would you point her to the supply closet and trust the man with the magazine cover? Right up until the moment, it was too late. Because the terrible truth of this story is that Adaeze Okonkwo was always there. She was there for 2 years. The answer to the impossible problem was mopping the floor of the very building that could not solve it. She did not become brilliant the day they finally listened. She was brilliant the whole time. Ina navi uniform. Being moved out of the way. The only thing that changed was that, for once, somebody stopped and heard a voice. the room had decided didn't count. Now think about the people you move out of the way. The ones you call by the wrong title? Or no title at all? The accent you stop listening to halfway through? The resume you slide back across the desk? Think about how many Adaeze Okonkwos are out there right now, holding the answer in their mouths, being told to swallow it. How many surgeons we have handed mops? How many healers we have ordered to stay in their lane? How much brilliance is mopping our floors at 2 in the morning because we decided, before they ever opened their mouths, exactly what they were worth? She walked into that hospital holding a mop. She walked out holding a scalpel and a little girl's whole future. Not because anyone gave her permission, because she finally refused to let them decide what she was worth. If you have ever been looked through, if you have ever held a truth in your mouth that a room full of people decided didn't count, then this story is yours. So tell me, down in the comments, what is the thing you know, the gift you carry, that the world keeps pointing toward the supply closet? Who is the Adaeze in your life that everyone walks past? And if you'd been standing in that corridor when the cleaning lady said stop, would you have laughed with the chief? Or would you have been the one who said, wait, let her speak? Subscribe, so the next time the world hands a genius a mop, you're the kind of person who stops to listen. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere, right now, in a building made of marble, another Adaeze is being told to use the service elevator. And the body, every single time, is still telling the truth. The only question left is whether we are humble enough and human enough to finally listen.